Thank you all for joining. My name is Claire Escamilla. I'm with the Texas Water Resources Institute. I appreciate you all joining us for our Ag Habitat Work Group that's working for our Petronila and San Fernando Creeks Watershed Protection Plan. As we mentioned at our first kickoff meeting, y'all's input as stakeholders and locals in the watershed are really important as we develop this plan to make sure that it's going to be accepted in the watershed. So y'all taking the time to attend this meeting and share your opinions with us, we really appreciate it. So for this meeting, we are focusing on agricultural and habitat concerns within the watershed. This is a more targeted work group meeting. We're having other work group meetings for different topics like septic systems, urban stormwater, wastewater treatment facilities, and then a science and monitoring work groups at different points throughout the next couple weeks. So I don't want you to think that we think that this is the only water quality concern in the watershed. We just find that it's beneficial to kind of break it up and talk to people with expertise in this area specifically. And then after we kind of refine our numbers and talk to y'all about management measures, we then present it to the bigger stakeholder group. So our goal for today is we want to talk to y'all about some of the livestock and wildlife population estimates that we've been kind of generating in the watershed and get y'all's opinions if you think that that is what is realistic and what's on the ground, what y'all are seeing. After we talk about that and refine those estimates, we want to talk to y'all about what our next steps will be, which will be to do some select modeling in the watershed and how we can use that as a tool to help in our watershed protection plan development. And then very briefly at the end, we want to start the discussion on potential management measures. This is something we're going to get into a lot more detail in our next work group meeting. So we really just want to plant that seed so y'all can start thinking about what some of these management measures are so we can have a fruitful discussion when we get together for our next meeting. So I want to start off talking about the population estimates. And the reason why this is important is we know that livestock, wildlife, they are contributors of bacteria. So they can impact the water quality in the watershed. So we use these estimates to help estimate how much they might be be a potential loading of bacteria in the watershed. And it just helps us to prioritize the management recommendations. So looking at population estimates and where they might be more densely populated helps us decide where there might be higher priorities for implementation of specific management measures or areas where it might not be as much of a water quality concern. So that's why we like to generate these. Kind of the main ones that we are going to present to y'all today is our estimates for cattle, feral hogs, deer. We also do estimates for dogs and cats, but we'll talk about that more with the urban work group because we see a lot more pets in those urban areas. And then we also do have estimates for hogs, sheep, horses, goats, and poultry. But you'll see when we talk about those estimates that their population numbers are much smaller. So we don't see them as big contributors to bacteria loading in the watershed, but we'll definitely want to present those to y'all and get your thoughts as well. We know that waterfowl, birds, and bats can sometimes be obviously contributors to bacteria and can be problems in different watersheds. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of data out there for us to really characterize those estimates. So we don't have any population estimates for birds or bats. I want to present all the population estimates to y'all first, but what I want y'all to think about as we go through them is, are there any other populations that you think we might be missing that we should be characterizing? Or are there some of these that we're talking about that probably are not big contributors at all, and maybe we don't need to worry about addressing as thoroughly in the watershed protection plan? So we'll have a discussion after these first couple slides talking about the estimates, and then I'll want to hear from y'all what you kind of think about these specific populations and if there's any other ones we should look at including. So where do we come up with these population estimates? Well, we look at a lot of just existing available data. So looking on locally, regionally, statewide, and national data sets. A lot of times that comes from The USDA or NRCS, our sister agency, the Natural Resource Institute, from our state agencies, Parks and Wildlife or the Commission on Environmental Quality. And as well at TWRI, we've had some different historical studies that we've done and can help, that we use to help estimate some of these populations. So we look at that, those larger data sets, as well as if there's recommended stocking rates, we'll look at the land cover and the stocking rates based on those estimates to try to come up with the estimates. And so after we have that, which is what I'm going to be presenting to y'all right now, we want to hear the input from y'all, because we know a lot of times this existing data, it might be collected every several years or sometimes even longer. So, and the populations of these estimates can change yearly depending on climate or different conditions in the watershed. So we want to know what y'all think, if you think that these estimates are accurate to what y'all are seeing on the ground there, or if we need to tweak it, if it's an underestimate or an overestimate. So what we do is, especially for the National Ag Statistical Survey, which is where we get some of our population estimates, they report things on a county level. And obviously watersheds don't follow those jurisdictional boundaries. So the watershed goes through parts of several different counties. And you can see the counties that the Petronila and San Fernando Creek go through here. And so what we do is we try to scale down those county estimates to what's in the watershed by looking at the total county area, as well as the area of the watershed from that county within the watershed, and then look at those percentages. So then when we see those populations, we scale that down to the percentage of that county that's in the watershed. And that's how we use that to try to get these initial estimates. Also for stocking rates, we're looking at land use and land cover. So I just kind of want to remind y'all, I think we presented this at our first meeting with the land use and land cover, and we get this from the National Land Cover Database. But you can see shrub and scrub and cropland are kind of the main land covers, and then the rest are smaller percentages throughout the watershed. But just kind of keep that in mind, because when we talk about stocking rates, we'll refer back to some of these land uses and land covers. So the National Ag Statistical Survey, it's created and generated from the USDA to try to measure agricultural production across the nation. So it is a national survey of cattle, sheep, goats, horses, hogs, and poultry. They conducted every 5 years. There are a few interim studies that aren't as extensive, but they give you a good idea of what things are, the trends in the watershed or in the counties. So the most recent available one is the 2017. So that's the data that we used for these initial estimates. And then for the recommended stocking rates, for cattle, we use the Farm Service Agency has stocking rate recommendations based on forage type and land cover. The Parks and Wildlife, they have different estimates for deer density for different regions across the state. So they break it up onto something called resource management unit. So based on the area for Petronila and San Fernando Creek, it has its own research management unit, which has a recommended number of acres per deer. And we use that to generate our deer population estimates. And then we use Texas A&M AgriLife, some previous research that's been done for estimating our feral hog densities. So for cattle, we want to show you both because they are slightly different. So this is one section where we do really want to get y'all's opinion on. So looking at that 2017 National Agricultural Statistical Survey data and scaling those county level data into our watershed, where we see that they're estimating about 38,235 cattle within our watershed. When we look at the Farm Service Agency stocking rates, and you can see this table down here is the Baffin Bay USDA recommended stocking rates. And so you can see based on the land cover, and these don't directly match up with our National Land Cover Database land cover. So you can see kind of off to the side, pasture and grassland, we're looking at the classifications of pasture and hay, light brush, grassland, and herbaceous. Average, medium, heavy brush is that shrub and scrub. So based on that land cover in which county it falls in, these were the stocking rates. And so when we add up all of those for our watershed, it's estimating cattle at about 52,722. So that is a wider gap between those two estimates. So that is one area where we do really want y'all's opinion. Do you think the number of cattle in the watershed is closer to this 38, closer to the 52, maybe somewhere in between, or somewhere for a different number entirely? So when we open it up to discussion, that's something that I do really want to hear from y'all. For the other livestock, we did use that 2017 National Agricultural Statistical Survey data again. And this is where I mentioned before, where it just seemed like these populations, total in the watershed, 445, 1,000, 2,000, compared to the 38 or possibly 52, it's just a much smaller population in the watershed. So we don't see it as it being a big contributor to bacteria and E. coli in the watershed. But we'd love to hear y'all's opinion on that. And then so for wildlife, for deer, we use those research management unit density estimates for the different counties, and we're estimating about 30,000 deer in the watershed. And then for feral hogs, we used the Texas A&M survey. I think it's about 33.3 acres per feral hog. And so using that, we got a number that's around 38,235 feral hogs within the watershed. So with that, that's kind of our initial estimates, and I can refer back to any of those slides, but I want to open it up now to the group. Kind of what's your take on these population estimates? Do you think we need to increase one or decrease another? How much rangeland, shrub and scrub is used for livestock? That was obviously a big part of the watershed is the shrub and scrub, and we used that in the stocking rates. Is the distribution of livestock across the counties even, or are there high density areas y'all are familiar with? What adjustments need to be made to improve these estimates? And again, back to those original questions, do you think we're missing a population that we should somehow be accounting for? So I'm gonna go back to this one just to start here with cattle, because we do want to get y'all's opinion on these, and feel free to unmute, or if you feel more comfortable writing it in the chat, either way.
Claire, this is Brian Koch. This is combined Petronila and San Fernando, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to what Claire just said, I think whenever I saw this difference in the 2017 NAS data versus the applied stocking rates based on those numbers that we got from FSA, that big of a difference kind of shocked me at first. But then I got thinking about it. I was like, especially out in Duval County, perhaps where that biggest difference is, there's a lot of rangeland out there. And I'm curious how much of that rangeland is actually used for grazing nowadays. I know I haven't spent a ton of time in that part of the world, but just driving through there, you see a lot of really, really big ranches out there nowadays that maybe don't have hardly any cattle or even none at all, and they're used exclusively for hunting purposes. So I was curious if anybody had any insight on that. If there was a scientific wild guess y'all could throw at maybe what percentage of the rangeland across the, I guess more so San Fernando Creek watershed might be used for wildlife only as opposed to grazing too.
This is Jim Rogers. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. I'm trying to think. I'd have to see it from the beginning, but on the FSA stocking rates, like usually when I see that, I think of, I'm trying to figure out how y'all kind of applied that by looking at this real quick. But usually that's more of a recommendation on how many acres it takes to support a cow. I guess y'all did the translation of that.
Right.
Okay, of how many there would be there if. Yeah. Anyway, I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just, we kind of use it as a triangulation, if you want to call it that, because the NAS numbers, they're obviously published at the county level, and we're not looking at the entirety of the county. So there's obviously some discrepancy there, and those numbers are now pushing 5 years old too. So there's obviously going to be some difference there. So what we always do is we use those recommended stocking rates and basically apply them unilaterally to all of the appropriate land uses across the watershed. And we realize that's an overestimation. But again, it kind of gives us a litmus test, if you will, just to see how close those NAS numbers are. And they're not terrible. I mean, they're more than 10% off, but still, I've seen worse in other watersheds before. Anyways, it's one of those where there's certainly some, maybe the answer is in between there somewhere. We just don't know. And at the end of the day, we're just looking for a good estimate of livestock. I mean, because once we put a number on the paper, it's going to be different tomorrow and the next day, just based on market conditions, climate conditions, and all the other things in between. So we're not looking for a perfect number by any stretch of the imagination. So I guess, or go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, there are definitely some ranches that are, going, that have kind of gotten rid of the cattle and gone wildlife only, and done some of the, doing some of their management that they need to do, like through prescribed burns and stuff like that, instead of grazing versus grazing and stuff like that. But it's not, I wouldn't think it's in this area that we're talking about. It's not a crazy amount of acres, I guess, on the rangeland.
Okay.
Stuff that has been, where cattle have been removed and stuff like that, versus some other areas, a couple counties over kind of deal. So anyway, I'm just thinking out loud, I guess. It's hard to say anything definitive right now without wrapping my head around it for a little while.
Right. Well, and certainly if you have an epiphany tomorrow or something like that and it all comes to you, then let us know. But we're not expecting that from you, Jim.
Okay.
So, and really the goal in presenting these numbers is to just throw some stuff out there to as food for thought, and see if there's some ideas about what's appropriate. And I mean, just looking at these, if one of those numbers looks like it's fairly reasonable from y'all's perspective, then we can call it good and roll with that number. And again, the goal is to just come up with a reasonable estimate of the livestock populations out there across the watershed, and use that for the basis of estimating potential E. coli loads from those sources, and using that as a comparison to the other things that are out there across the watershed as well. So I guess at this point, does one of those respective approaches look better than the other?
I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head that, the NAS data, I mean, just because it's based on something a little bit, until we can figure out another way to, to check that FSA data that you got. I mean, I like, but I'm not basing off of anything other than I like that that's a little bit more in stone type data, versus more of an estimate.
Right. Well, I guess maybe something to throw into consideration relative to that NAS data is that obviously the distribution of land uses and land covers across the county are not necessarily equal. I know like Duval County, it's largely similar, at least in the part of the watershed we're looking at, and seems to be pretty much the same out to the west of there as well. But like in Nueces County, there's a ton of cropland right there along the highway and everything, and down to the coast where it turns into the more natural prairie landscapes there. And then, but the upper end, up around Orange Grove, there's a lot more pastures and rangeland up that way. So obviously the numbers that are presented in those county level assessments might not accurately reflect the distribution of those animals across the watershed, or within that perspective part of the watershed at least. So that's something to think about as well. Again, it's a scientific best guess is really kind of the best thing we got at this point, and certainly not looking to go out and do a individual survey of just this watershed or anything like that, to I guess perfect those numbers, if you want to call it that. But I tend to agree with you though, Jim. I mean, the NAS numbers do come from hard data, and that's a tried and true method that they use to go out and capture those. And I don't think it's gonna, tweaking those numbers one way or the other is not gonna greatly change the result of the assessment that we're gonna do from a potential E. coli loading or anything like that. So I'm fine with sticking with those NAS numbers as long as everybody else is.
Yeah, Lucas, just in my experience, a lot of the times the local stakeholder numbers that they've given us have matched pretty closely with the NAS data. It doesn't happen every time, but the past few times I've done it, it's been really close. I mean, one time it was like right on. So I think, yeah, it was, which I don't know how that happened, but it did. And I think we were within 100 animals really. And, so, I mean, I'd probably lean more toward that NAS number than just going off of, and I know all watersheds are different, but we can always keep asking too. So.
Okay. Well, and I mean, we'll obviously send our meeting notes out after this meeting and let everybody know what the discussion was and kind of what the general consensus was on what's better. And if there's any other inputs or suggestions or comments that we get as follow-up, we can certainly take them into consideration as now. But like you said, those NAS numbers are generally okay. Really, the only time I've seen them where they have been way off is up in the Panhandle, where you get a lot of feedlots. And sometimes those cattle get counted in your county totals. And if you got feedlots in your watershed, then it's all right. But if you don't, then your number looks wicked large. And you're like, wow, there's no way in the world there could be that many cattle in here under a normal grazing condition. But then you think about it from a feedlot perspective, and it makes a lot more sense. But that's really the only place I've seen where they get far off.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. I've been talking to myself here. Finally got my microphone turned on. I would also tend to agree that the NASH data would probably be a little bit closer. That FSA number, just looking at the Nueces pasture grassland, that's going to be a little off for sure. So I would tend to go with lean more heavily towards that NASH data, in my opinion.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So I guess relative to the NAS data, are there any issues or concerns or questions about the other livestock that are counted in the NAS data? Like and whenever we say hogs, these are domestic hogs. So maybe show pigs or just some small, really small farm type operations. And then obviously horses, sheep, and goats are what they are, but we're not talking feral hogs here. And so generally what we do as far as application of these animals across the watershed is to basically commingle them with your cattle land uses. Hogs are a little bit different, and typically we just kind of don't deal with them so much. I mean, especially given the low numbers relative to other livestocks that are out there in the watershed. Every now and then you'll have a watershed that has a lot of hogs in there, but it's really a small drop in the bucket compared to cattle and the horses and other livestock animals that are out there. So we don't consider hogs being pastured animals per se, that they're more in a confined space. It's not a confined animal feeding operation type situation, but a small pen next to the barn is more appropriate for those guys. But horses, goats, sheep, and cattle, we pretty much treat them the same as far as the grazing potential out there across the watershed. Now that said, I know goats typically get put on some rougher terrain. So I guess a question for y'all, in this case, would it be more appropriate to apply them only to your shrub scrub land use, or are I guess a number of goats also applied to pasture type settings?
One thing I would think as far as, I was thinking about this before you asked that specific question, with horses, to me, they'll be more widespread across the area versus goats. Like, thinking, I don't know of a ton of places that, I know there's people out there with goats, but I don't know of a ton of places that have it. They're going to be a large herd here and there or whatever, where horses are more kind of widespread.
Right.
Just, observation from that point of view, I guess. Trying to think, what was your question about the goat? Yeah, whether to use it just on the thorn scrub and scrub.
Yeah, they're more common on that rangeland type land, like shrub scrub, as opposed to a pasture or something like that.
I think it'd definitely be mixed, but in a lot of cases, I think they're going to be, utilizing the brush. They're going to be in the pastures with the brush in most cases. But there will definitely be both. I don't know how you would split that really, other than, kind of asking around and kind of getting some sort of estimate, maybe a little bit. But.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's not a perfect estimate, and in the grand scheme of things, it's probably kind of a moot point, to be honest with you. But
yeah.
They
may mix a herd. Also, a herd of goats might also be, run back and forth depending on time of the year and stuff like that too. Also,
right.
So it might not even be worth. They may have access to both types of situations, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I guess generally speaking, a lot of the grazing potential is I guess, farther west in the watershed. If you look at the land use land cover map, especially like the eastern, really 3/4 of Petronila is almost exclusively cropland. Whereas San Fernando, it's dominated more by that rangeland and your pastures as opposed to the cropland. So we'll have, I guess, less of a challenge kind of distributing those across those watersheds. But nonetheless, we can certainly tinker around with the numbers. And like I said, at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference one way or the other as far as prioritizing areas that might benefit more from a livestock-based management recommendation or something like that. Well, unless anybody's got any other comments about the livestock numbers, we'll just stick with those NASS numbers for now and use that as our estimates for the livestock that's distributed out there across the landscape. And really, rather than singling out one species of livestock versus the other, what we'll do is we'll just aggregate those into one livestock-based loading assessment. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to do that here later, but we'll basically just lump them all together and have a livestock potential load as opposed to singling out cattle or horses or sheep or goats or anything like that, because really the management recommendations are one and the same for any and all species. So no real need to or I guess purpose in splitting those out. But I guess switching gears over to the wildlife, I guess initially any questions or comments or concerns about these estimates? So I know one question I had, and it's relative to kind of the distribution of these critters across the landscape. Just given the sheer volume of cropland in the Petronila watershed, how, I guess, common are hogs and deer in that landscape? I know they utilize cropland. You see evidence of them just leveling fields here and there and everywhere. But there's a lot of land with very little like permanent cover that they utilize, and I know they also like to go back to that permanent cover and escape us human predators, I guess, if you want to call us that. So any, I guess, insight on how prevalent feral hogs and deer are in that cropland dominated portion of the watershed?
Well, before you brought that up, that's what I was kind of thinking on that Petronila area, up Nueces and Clayburgh County. Like there's enough little pockets of brush that it seems like they support lots of hogs still, but the deer numbers would be way down in those areas. It's not enough cover and not enough habitat to support the deer. It seems like the densities are kind of low in these I'm talking these small little sanctuary areas where there's enough cover for a hog to go lay up during the day or whatever, but there is a pretty decent population of hogs even in that wide open cropland because there is enough cover within, half a mile, and then during the course of the night, they'll wander and then end up back in those little sanctuaries.
Right.
But it doesn't support the deer herd in that area that I have in mind. The population of deer are pretty low in that same area. And a lot of that Petronila, where the cropland is,
yeah,
a different story when you get, out of that cropland dominated area.
Well, and I know one way we've dealt with kind of distributing hogs in areas that they might not normally be considered to inhabit is using like a riparian buffer. So if you've got a riparian corridor or something like that where there's an abundance of good cover, those hogs are naturally going to set up shop there and use that as home base, and then range out from there at night and go terrorize the cropland and whatnot. So typically what we'll do is we'll apply some sort of a buffer around that riparian area and load them into that area to basically ensure that they are being accounted for in that part of the watershed as well. But it also kind of normalizes the distribution across those areas where maybe the habitat doesn't support widespread populations or something like that. But we can certainly, I guess, tinker with the distribution of the deer across those croplands. I mean, we can adjust the density of the animals in certain land uses with the computer model that we'll be running. So we can certainly kind of evaluate that and kind of play around with it to make it right. So I guess, Jim, from your perspective, I don't know if you had to put a percentage on it, would you say, like, if you got a normal population of deer, what percentage of normal might you find in that cropland area?
Ooh,
Sorry, put you on the spot there.
First, before I do that, let me say this other comment I was thinking about the hog thing before. In a way, the hog population in that area that we're discussing is almost like migratory. So and I don't even know if it's a good word for hogs, but I'm saying, when the crops are in, that kind of deal, stage of the year, in those same areas that I'm talking about where there might be an overload of hogs during the right time of the year, they might almost be non-existent in others, So they are coming. There may be a way for us to estimate the year-round habitat to kind of come up with an estimate, knowing that they may move into that cropland and not necessarily give a lot of credit year-round to that cropland dominated area. Just assuming that most of that population does come from the year-round permanent, rangeland type habitat around it.
Okay.
Like you're saying, I just started thinking about. I know that they can be very, very in areas when it's the right time of the year, when all the milos in the field and stuff like that.
Yeah, they definitely know when the buffets open up.
Yeah, so it might not be. I'm sitting there thinking about the population. It might not be as much as I'm thinking it is, just because they're probably moving in from other areas and then retreat back to it later on.
Right.
And now that I've, postponed my answer for the deer, hoping I could come up with an answer. I mean, it's going to be, if you compare it to the rangeland around there that's intact and compare this area, I mean, it's going to be very minuscule percentage. I mean, if you had a deer to every 10 acres in the rangeland surrounding in that same county, in that same general area, compared to the, this is going to be more like a deer to, a couple of 100 acres or something in this area that I'm picturing, and that, because I mean, there's some pretty big areas that there is no cover for a long period of time, or
right.
Distances and stuff like that. So it's a bit, what would that be? It's like probably 5% of what it normally would be in the areas that are kind of intact and not fragmented, I guess.
Yeah. Well, 10% was the number that came to my head, so 5% is not far from that. So either we're both way wrong or great minds think alike, one of the two.
We'll go with 7.5.
Deal.
Hey, Lucas,
Yes, sir.
it's Robert down Kingville. Where'd y'all get those numbers from?
So we estimated those numbers based off of a couple of different data sets. So for deer, we contacted the Parks and Wildlife biologists there locally, and they do annual white-tailed deer surveys, and they come up with a what they call a resource management unit-wide density estimate for whitetail. And we basically look at the last 5 years and just kind of take an average density for that and then apply it out there across the appropriate land uses. And in this case, I think and Ennis, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we applied them to the shrub scrub, the mixed forest, grassland, herbaceous, and maybe wetland type areas, and then the other forests. Is that right, Ennis? Or did we also apply them to cropland?
I left out cropland and the wetland stuff.
Okay.
All the others you mentioned.
So basically, Robert, we took that density estimate and just did some math and calculated an estimate for deer. And then for feral hogs, it's a similar approach where there was an assessment done a number of years ago by A&M and some other partners. I think Parks and Wildlife collaborated with them, and actually some folks at the Welder Wildlife Refuge, and they came up with a density estimate of 1 hog per 33.3 acres. And nobody's that we've found has been able to come up with a better number. And like Jim was mentioning, hogs are so stinking nomadic that it's really tough to get a good handle on them. But we, again, just did the math, and we applied hogs to basically everything but your developed land uses in this case, and open water. Although I have seen pigs swim before, but they normally do hang out there.
And let's pretend, like I said, nomadic earlier instead of migratory. Sorry.
Yeah, nomadic. Yeah, well, no, and I agree with you. I think those numbers are a little high.
Okay.
Nothing to back it up, but
Yeah, it's a
like
challenge.
Cropland County.
It's a challenge. I mean, I remember one of the first watershed projects I did, we estimated a hog population for the watershed of, I don't know, we'll say 15 or 20,000 or whatever it was. And we asked all the local landowners what they thought about it. And we got everywhere from 1,500 to 150,000. So it was like a order of magnitude in both directions on what our initial estimate was. It's funny to hear some of the stories. And like my granddad, he always says that hogs have a litter of 6 and 8 survive. So whenever you think about it from that perspective, some of these estimates that you hear, they make a lot of sense. But yeah, that's the number that we typically use. And I mean, really, it's from a management perspective, it wouldn't matter if we put 150,000 in there versus that 38,000 for feral hogs, because the management recommendation is going to be the same regardless. Right. I mean, it's voluntary management, and do everything you can to get rid of those rascals is really what it boils down to. So, and really, whenever we look at the prioritization, and again, we'll talk about this model here in just a little bit, it really bases the kind of the priority areas on that land use and land cover that these critters utilize. So the population is kind of irrelevant in the overall prioritization. Now, whenever you look at potential load, and if you look at that number that gets generated, then yeah, the population weighs in on that. But if we're looking at it from okay, what parts of the watershed make the most sense to try and manage feral hogs, the number doesn't matter, because it's we're equally applying them across the appropriate land uses within the watershed. So, but that said, we do try to get a reasonable estimate put together to use in these, just because it makes a lot of sense to do that. And I like to be as right as possible, but I know this is a futile effort to have a perfect number.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Well, we'll use those numbers, and we'll certainly play around with the densities over in Petronila and that cropland land use. I know that's an interesting situation over there, just with the expanse of cropland and the lack of suitable habitat for the wild critters that require it. So we'll play around with that and see how it affects the prioritization models and basically the recommendations that come out of that. Claire, any other questions that we had that we haven't asked yet?
No, the only other one was, does anyone think that there's any other populations that we should include that we might have missed, or if there's some other data set where we might get a good estimation, let us know.
Yeah, one that I thought of that I don't know if it exists, but it could, with this watershed being close to or right on the coast rather, are there any like coastal waterfowl or shorebird estimates or anything like that that are out there that we might be able to integrate into this?
Well, I was just going to mention, like, I know that in that area, around Chapman Ranch and all that stuff, that's some pretty wet country. And there could be some big accumulations, of migrating waterfowl, some of that wet pasture and stuff like that, or even in the cropland in certain situations. But a lot of that stuff that's kind of gone out of cropland, it's kind of abandoned cropland, or it's grass now, but it floods and stuff like that. I don't have anything to add as far as where we get an estimate for that, but I know that it could be a accumulation, you would think.
Okay.
Way to get it out. So it might be worthy to try to find some sort of estimate. Let's work on that, I guess.
Lucas, this is Kirsten,
Hey.
the Coastal Basin Interest Program. You might look at, I don't know if the Gulf Coast Joint Venture might have anything. They do a lot of modeling efforts and things around specific populations of waterfowl in particular, but also other kinds of water birds as well. But anyways, I'm just trying to think of people who would have that kind of information. And then obviously, like, well, they're involved. They work closely. They would encompass a number of different partners, like Ducks Unlimited, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and stuff that would work on that issue with them. So I think they might be a spot to start. But I'm not sure what they have. So it's just kind of a total shot in the dark there. But I know they're do a lot of work around waterfowl, model ducks a lot. But you could get kind of maybe some estimates of other species too.
Right. Yeah, and I remember some large-scale data sets from a number of years ago that were available. I just don't know that work's been replicated in recent history and how relevant it might be in today's world. But yeah, Parks and Wildlife and Ducks Unlimited were certainly a couple that I thought about reaching out to. But we'll seek out the Gulf Coast Joint Venture instead as a way to maybe talk to one entity rather than multiples. So.
Hey, Lucas. Also, this is kind of out there a little bit, but Wade Harrell with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service he's the whooping crane coordinator, and he flies the coast every year, and he would have flown through there the last several years, and he does estimates all on the coast from one end to the other.
Okay.
And I mean, he may have something to add. They fly to certain times. I can't remember exactly the time when he flew it or whatever, but anyway, he may have some sort of estimate in that area, from his flights. I know he flies it on a yearly basis.
Okay.
And I know he keeps track of everything. He's looking for whooping cranes, but he's keeping track of everything along the way, from what I remember.
Okay.
I saw that he reported. So.
Do you happen to have his contact info?
Yeah, I can get it to you.
Okay, that'd be awesome.
I know him pretty well and work with him here and there, and we go way back, so I know him pretty well. I'll get that to you.
Perfect. Well, I know certain times of the year those waterfowl populations can be pretty thick down there, and it really makes me want to be out there with a pair of waders and a good dog. But that's neither here nor there. Well, I personally don't have any other questions. I think there's been enough information we've gathered from y'all for us to kind of move on to the next step. But if y'all have any other questions or comments or thoughts or anything at this point before we talk about the select model? If not, then I'll jump into that right quick. So I mentioned that we would be doing some work to help prioritize what parts of the watershed might be, I guess, more in need or more likely candidates for management recommendations. And the tool that we use to do that in most cases is the select model. So it's basically a calculation tool that looks at a lot of spatial data and E. coli loads from the various sources that we apply it. So really those E. coli sources are based a lot on the land use that's out there, simply because of the distribution of the animals that are associated with the land use, or the distribution of other sources like septic systems, wastewater treatment facilities, and things of that nature, which are not necessarily land use related, but they're affiliated or associated with human presence. So we look at those types of spatial features. The soils often play into this as well, especially as it relates to septic systems and how well or not well a septic system may be functioning based on the soil types and soil characteristics. And then obviously the population density. So that's really where our discussion about the livestock and wildlife estimates comes into play, and really the impetus behind trying to come up with a number for each of those to model out there across the watershed. So the input data that go into this are obviously the land use and land cover. We utilize the watershed boundaries and then the source information that we generate or acquire for the various E. coli sources that are out there. So the animal numbers, the septic systems, the wildlife populations, wastewater treatment facility locations, and other things as appropriate, like dogs, cats, and such as that. So we use the select model, and it integrates all of that information into basically a geographic information system that takes into consideration the spatial distribution of the layers, like the land use to soils, also takes into consideration the stream network, urban areas like city limits and things of that nature, and the soils and county boundaries. So really where some of those jurisdictional boundaries come into play are kind of dependent or drives the distribution of some of those animals. So like whenever we enter that NASS data in there, the population density for Duval County for livestock is going to be different than it is for Clayburgh County based on those numbers that are reported there. So that all plays into it. Next slide, please, Claire. So this is an example from the mid and lower Cibolo Creek watershed up kind of north and east of San Antonio. And this is the type of output that the select model generates. And basically what it does is we use smaller subsets of the watershed, typically a hydrologic unit code size 12, and that probably means not very little to y'all, but basically all the watersheds in the world are busted up into smaller and smaller sizes, and the size 12 watersheds are reasonable. They're usually on the order of about 30,000 acres apiece. So I don't remember offhand how many of those there are in the Petronila San Fernando Creek watersheds, but there's a pretty good number of them, just given the size of the watersheds combined. But basically what the outputs show is a relative potential of E. coli load from the evaluated source, whether it's an individual species or group like cattle or hogs or deer or whatever, or an aggregate. You can run various versions of the model and then sum them all together. So in this case, we would propose to do a livestock output where it aggregates the horses, sheep, goats, cows, and maybe even hogs into the mix as well. And you get an output that is not only color coded, but it's also has a numeric representation to it. So the watersheds that have a higher potential E. coli load are typically the darker color. So in this case, they're the darker browns out there, and the lower potential load are the yellows in this case, so the lighter color. And naturally, depending on the source that you're modeling, the distribution of those things change. So your septic system potential load is going to look fairly different than your wildlife potential load, because your septic systems are often associated with cities. They might be on the fringe, so like around Kingsville or around Alice, as opposed to right there in town, because in town they have a wastewater treatment facility that services those houses there. So we exclude that, but the surrounding area, there's usually a congregation of folks. Whereas on the flip side, like livestock, you're not going to have livestock in the town. I mean, of course, I grew up in a bump in the road town. We had calves in the backyard when I was a kid, but we were weird. But normally speaking, those animals are going to be distributed out there in the wide open spaces and in the appropriate land uses. So you're going to have different colors of map that are generated. But the utility of this is that it allows us a quick visual representation of those potential places to prioritize management. And again, all of these management recommendations that are going to be going in there are voluntary. So It's always up to the individual landowner to I guess, request assistance to manage the resource. And obviously, as it relates to livestock, that is usually through either NRCS contracts and conservation plans, or through the stormwater conservation districts and a water quality management plan. But the agencies that review the watershed protection plan and accept it, they love to see maps like this that make, I guess, visualization of those priority areas easy. So that's what the output will look like for Select in this case. We will have to do 2 separate assessments. So we'll do one for Petronila and one for San Fernando, because the way the model's set up is that it looks at things from a hydrological perspective. So we can only have one outlet for the watershed. And since we're doing a watershed plan on 2 sister watersheds, we can't have 2 outlets. So we'll basically run the model twice and export the data, and then we'll create our own layer to depict all the results at once, basically, just based off of that information that gets outputted. So we'll have to do a little bit of extra work behind the scenes to make that happen. But the ultimate goal will be to have I guess, loading potential maps for the various sources that are shown both for Petronila and San Fernando side by side. But we can also look at the data independently as well. And that's very appropriate, especially in this case where Petronila and San Fernando land uses are fairly different in a lot of situations, especially as it relates to cropland and whatnot. So in a general sense, that's what the Select model is. And it does demonstrate that worst case scenario. So there's no bacteria die-off or anything like that that's taken into consideration. So what this thing is modeling is basically what's leaving the animal or the source of that E. coli. But it does show that relative potential across the watershed. So generally speaking, the smaller sub-basins within the watershed may have lower potential just because of the less space that they have to accommodate animals or septic systems or whatever it might be that we're evaluating. But really the value in this is that it does help prioritize where those management practices might be best or might get the best bang for the buck. And I guess one thing to mention is that the E. coli loading that comes out of the model is based on literature values. I mean, there's been a world of science conducted over the years to evaluate how much E. coli is coming out of a cow and how much is coming out of a horse and how much is coming out of a deer. And all the other things that we would be modeling. And there's tons of variation across the board. So we use an average value that's been basically, I guess, accepted by the agencies that review watershed plans as reasonable estimates. And we plug those numbers in to get the loading estimates. So we're not using one number in one part of the watershed and a different number in the other part of the watershed. It's treated equally across the board. So there's no, I guess, favoritism in one direction or the other, so to speak. So let's see, I think that's it. Yeah, so that's a super high level overview of the Select model, but it's actually a fairly simple tool. It integrates a good bit of information and resources into the model, but in its I guess, simplest form, it's really kind of a math exercise where you're looking at the population, multiplying out the E. coli load and applying it to an area of the watershed and just visualizing it. So that tool takes several steps out of the process, and we don't have to do the work manually that way. So at this point, are there any questions about the Select model, or anything like that? Okay. Well, our intentions at this point are, after this meeting, obviously we'll go back to work and we'll actually take the numbers that we talked about for the animals and apply those to the watershed and actually run that Select model. Like I said, we'll do one run for Petronila, one run for San Fernando, and then present the results in combined fashion in the watershed protection plan. And we can talk about results individually during the next work group meeting, but we'll have those draft results to show y'all at the next meeting, and we can kind of pour through those and talk about them and discuss it to our heart's desire and all that good stuff. So next on the list is to really kind of prime the pump for the bulk of our discussion at our next meeting. And our next meeting, we really want to kind of hash out and talk through the management recommendations that will go into the plan to address potential E. coli loading from agricultural related sources and wildlife related sources. So typically what we do for these watershed plans is put together kind of a table that looks a lot like this. I know there's a lot of words on that page and I'm not expecting y'all to read them or anything like that, but basically what this table does is it clearly states the problem and the objectives of the management recommendation, and then it points out those priority areas, kind of like we were just talking about that select model producing. And then we state the goals of the management recommendation and then just generally describe it. Like I mentioned earlier, conservation plans developed through NRCS and water quality management plans developed in local stormwater conservation districts are the primary mechanism that normally gets used to deal with livestock related recommendations or livestock related management. And again, it's all based on that landowner taking the initiative to request that assistance. And if through the planning process, might even get some funding to support it as well. So generally what we do is we will take a look at the watershed and figure out the average number of operations that are out there, whether they be farms or ranches, their average size, and then look at maybe an average number of animals that each of the operations contain. And again, this is a very rough estimate of things, but short of going and doing a very extensive like door-to-door survey across the watershed, we're not going to really get a better bit of information about it. But we look at the size of the operations and the extent of them, and then we kind of use that as a way to back calculate how many conservation plans or water quality management plans might be appropriate and potentially even necessary to address those E. coli loads from livestock. So we come up with a recommended number, and then I know at least in the case of water quality management plans, they're limited to $15,000 of financial assistance per WQMP. So we can just do some simple math and come up with a cost estimate for that. Obviously, like EQIP and other programs have different limits and whatnot relative to available funds and things of that nature. But we try to put some numbers behind it just to give the folks that review these plans an idea of what the cost might be. Obviously, the costs are well beyond that because of the cost share contributions from the landowner and things of that nature. But it gives us a good idea about this kind of what some needs are as far as assistance is concerned.
Lucas, can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
At some point, maybe you said this already and I missed it. I apologize. Is there an effort for that to actually figure out how many CPs and WQMPs are already in place? Because I know there's quite a few. So
why, yes, we actually have a slide here in just a minute that documents all that. So in fact, Claire, you can bounce over to that one already. Because honestly, I think pretty much everybody on the call understands what a water quality management plan is. Actually, Claire, you got Brian pulled the numbers on the water quality management plans for us across Petronila Creek and San Fernando. So there's already a good number of those plans out there in the watershed. And I mean, there's the general information on them. I know we can get information about what practices are included in those. That might take us a little bit longer, but we can certainly get that information, and we can do the same for NRCS contracts as well. I know we've worked with Kyle Wright in the past to get information on stuff like that as well. So
yeah, Lucas, this is Brian. I mean, I can tell you in general what the practices are. I know, in cropland, you're going to see residue management, which is crop residue on the surface to help keep help soil keep soils in place. Also tillage, minimum tillage practices, nutrient management, and there might be a few others here and there in cropland, but then pasture, it's going to be that grazing management using the rotational grazing, monitoring grass heights, rest, all those things that go into rotational grazing. And then, we do have those other land uses can include, forms of wildlife management or riparian management, or there's also heavy use area, around barns and headquarters and stuff where they're mixing chemicals and, doing stuff, filling tanks and everything to protect, resources near those. But we, for the most part, it's just going to revolve around a lot of those management measures we're looking at rolled into the plans, and some plans might just be crop and some might just be pasture, and then but a lot of them are a combination of both. So you're getting a lot of benefits out of all of them, wherever they're coming from. So
Right.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely, and honestly, I know folks at EPA like to see what's already going on in the watershed and what's already being implemented, and they also like to see maybe what's preferred to be implemented. And I know what is in the existing conservation plans and WQMPs is probably a good gauge on what the preference is, because those producers get a chance to at least weigh in on that. They may not get everything they want, but they at least have an opinion in there. So one thing we've done in other watersheds, we've actually done a little questionnaire or a survey, if you want to call it that, just to gauge people's interest on the various practices. And we actually put one together for y'all to quickly take, if y'all don't mind. And basically what we did is we just pulled relevant practices from the Field Office Tech Guide for Texas, and just would like some opinions on what I guess the appropriateness of the practice is, and the likelihood that it might actually be implemented could be. So we'll send this out to a broader group of folks after our work group meeting, just to see if we can get some additional responses. But again, the inputs and feedback we get from Kyle on the NRCS practices that are in there as well will also be useful. So, and I think Claire put the link to that survey in the chat.
Mm-hmm. And that was kind of my next question, Lucas, again, was, so then, yeah, is there some effort, and maybe this is done by the agencies who work on these plans. I know about the plans, but I not in great detail or anything. And so, then what's the effort to actually figure out what's being implemented in the plans? Yeah,
so, and I know Brian and Sonny and other folks can probably talk in better detail about them, but in general sense, basically the producer comes in, he requests assistance from either NRCS or the Soil Water Conservation District, which if it's Soil Water Conservation District, they collaborate and coordinate with NRCS staff anyway. And they basically talk about their goals and objectives for their property and what they would like assistance with. And then there's a site visit and basically an evaluation of the resources that are there and kind of the goals and objectives. And then it's I guess a mixture of practices that will help achieve those goals, all while having positive soil benefits, water benefits, and things of that nature. So it's really an effort to work with the producer to accomplish their production goals while also accomplishing the environmental objectives of NRCS and the soil board as well. So and then obviously each plan is different as far as what's recommended and prescribed within those plans. So there's not a one size fits all solution for every property, and they really are a unique plan for each space. But we can get some general numbers about like the number of acres of grazing management or nutrient management or conservation tillage and stuff like that that are out there across those watersheds. And
plus, I guess I was getting at, yeah, what's the numbers of you know, that were suggested in the plans versus what's actually being done. Because I guess to me, it's like if there's already a ton of plans out there, but nobody's doing anything because it's, say, a lack of funding or something, that seems like it's something that the watershed protection planning process could highlight. Like there's actually already a lot of good WPMPs here, but you know, people aren't able to implement them because they don't have the money to do it or something like that. So, you know, how is that being tracked, and how could we use that to tell a better story about what, you know, what we actually need to do in the area? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I know at least in the case of the water quality management plans, those producers, once if they sign that contract, they're compelled to implement the practices that it includes. So they get the technical assistance, and then they've got X amount of time to get those practices installed and functional. And then there's a time, like a maintenance time requirement. So some practices, they've got a 5-year lifespan. Some of them have a 15-year lifespan. So they're obligated to keep them functional and maintained for the lifespan of the practice.
And I definitely don't want it to be like a calling out someone, you know, like, you know,
Right.
I don't want to sound like that in any way. For me, I'm just trying to figure out, you know, someone who like wants to try to find resources to help these things be implemented, like what, you know, where's if there is a lack of like ability to implement these things, what is it, you know, and where should we focus? So.
Right. Yeah. And generally speaking, the folks that have these plans in place are usually already doing a good job anyway. They just want to do better. And I mean, you can see from the total number of acres that are under the WQMPs in the 2 watersheds, there's still a lot of opportunity for additional plans that are out there. And I know NRCS contracts probably cover multiple times more land across the watershed than WQMPs do, but we'll do what we can to document what's already there, and then talk about additional needs to further improve local water quality conditions.
Okay, thanks.
So, but yeah, if y'all don't mind, just take a few minutes and provide us some feedback on that survey. Again, it's stuff that we can glean from the existing contracts and the existing information, but having that feedback at least was well received in previous watershed plans because it shows I guess the local desires for management, and who knows, may shed some light on stuff that people would really like to do that maybe isn't so popular in the area for one reason or the other. Let's see, what else do we have, Claire? The discussion questions, yes. Well, you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure. So just some final discussion questions before we kind of wrap it up is we want to know if y'all already kind of, after hearing, you know, how we're using those population estimates, kind of the management measures we're hoping to implement, do you see any possible barriers for implementation? Whether there might not be a lot of support from other landowners, do you see any possible barriers that we should already be anticipating and maybe somehow be proactive in addressing? And then what other activities do you think are important to bring to the watershed to help encourage the implementation once we've finalized development of the protection plan? So we didn't talk about it much today, but definitely education and outreach are big foundations for a lot of our the management measures, because it just helps build support and awareness for water quality concerns and how to be good land stewards. So some things we were thinking about is, you know, should we be putting in the plan, trying to bring in some ag field days and demonstrations, types of educational trainings that you think would be important to bring to this area to help garner kind of support and enthusiasm for the plan and implementation. Is funding going to be a big issue for implementing some of these conservation practices? Do you think folks need more technical assistance, and that might be one of the barriers? So just kind of wanted to open it up just to kind of get some folks' ideas on, you know, other opportunities that we should be thinking about putting into this plan to support agricultural and habitat concerns and landowners in the watershed.
I know in the past, from a program implementation standpoint, I'm talking specifically EQIP from an NRCS standpoint, cropland in the general watershed area, it seems like we have some issues with establishing control of the property. So like Lucas was mentioning earlier, there's some of our practices have practice lifespans. And a lot of the cropland acres in the watershed typically don't have very long leases. So that's one of the issues that we've encountered over the years, where there's a change of control of the property, and that might dictate what can and can't be done on some of these properties, because it's my understanding that a lot of this country is lease country, and a lot of these farmers are basically they're just leasing the property. They don't own it, so they can be kicked off at any time. So that's one obstacle that's come up in the past for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, this is Kirsten again. I'm glad Sunny brought that up, because that's such a
Sorry.
big issue that we've dealt with. Just, when it comes to trying to do grant projects for whatever it is, the number of leaseholders that are in this area versus actual owner operators is a big challenge that we're always dealing with, it seems like.
So y'all think maybe some, I don't know, like a direct mailer to the actual landlord or landowner might be useful, and maybe, I don't know, encouraging some adoption of conservation practices? Maybe they might be more willing to work with their tenants on things, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I guess it's maybe even to some type of help to facilitate that conversation between the landowner and the leasee about, coming up with some new ways to think about this, how they set up their relationship almost, because that affects these things. I don't know if that's something that other resource agencies are already trying to deal with or not, but it's just like there needs to be some type of recognition by the two different groups together of some of those obstacles that stand in the way, and how we could come up with some solutions for that. And I don't know if that's something we can kind of propose ahead of time.
So I got a small sample size to draw on here, but we recently wrapped up a direct mailer program on one of our other watershed-based efforts, and it was focused more on grazing operations, and they're obviously probably more long-term ownership or lease situations. So a little bit different issue here, but the direct mailers, they generated like a 400% increase in traffic into the local NRCS office, requesting information and assistance through conservation programs. Obviously, I think we overwhelmed the local pool of funds for financial assistance at this point, but the information got out there, the interest was increased, and it really proved to be a very cost-effective way to get that information out there in front of them and get a documentable response. I mean, it's been phenomenal, really, to see how that's all worked out. Now, what that translates into as far as on the ground practices is to be determined still, but at least it gets folks in the door and gets that conversation going. And basically what it was is it was a front and back postcard. It was an oversized postcard, I guess, maybe like a third of a page size, and we mailed those out 4 times to basically all of the ag producers in like the given area. And like I said, I think the traffic into the local NRCS office went from like about 80 to 90 people per year over the last 4 to 5 years to like 360 or something in this past year. And that was, it started pre-COVID and went into COVID. So the results may be even more compelling later on if we do it without COVID being a factor. But that's certainly something that we could try here as well.
We appreciate that extra work you brought us, Lucas. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I did ask Alan about that. I was like, so how do the local NRCS guys feel about that?
Well, what I was going to say too is, like, you said that you probably overwhelmed the local fund sources. I mean, and this is something that's going to come down the road as it's being implemented, but, I mean, there is, other than the local funds that are kind of typically available, we have a lot of initiatives that come and go where there's a national pool of money that we're pulling from that sometimes gets underutilized. So if we could find a formula, knowing the current situation with the initiatives and that national pool of money, we might be able to develop a formula for stuff to kind of apply very easily to tap into some of that money. If we write it up the right way and get almost like a recipe is what I'm kind of thinking on a typical situation. We might be able to get some applications into to apply for that national money that we may not run out of, because some of that stuff doesn't even get used up at times.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you got some thoughts or ideas on which programs that throw them out there, man, we'll take them all into consideration. And I know we've been able to capitalize on the RCPP program and a couple of other watersheds over the years, and that's been a great source of a much larger pool of funding. I know we did one in the Valley for the Arroyo, Colorado a couple of years ago, and it was like 2.8 million, I think was the number, give or take a little bit. And it was supposed to be available for 5 years, and I think that it got used in 3.5. So there's definitely plenty of demand out there for those cost share programs or financial assistance programs. I think that's the favorable term nowadays. But anyways, yeah, that's certainly something that we can look into for this area. And I think Bath can be a great candidate for it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
oh, go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
I was going to say, we did something similar in Lower San Antonio. We got their EQIP resource concern for bacteria in the water or water quality, and several watersheds, but Lower San Antonio River had the most implementation. We wrote over 100 water quality management plans, and then they used those EQIP dollars to implement, and we got two or three delistings on different segments down there. So, it's definitely, if you can plug in people to the implementation dollars, I think you can bring them in the door and get some things done.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, and that I know, the the idea is to get this plan and then you go implement it, but hopefully, like, if y'all are willing, we can try to keep some of these conversations going while we're doing that, the planning process as well, because I think, we're geared up for a lot of this stuff already. I know we've been looking at how to trying to put in something for RCPP down here, and but haven't really done it yet because we needed to get a few more things kind of lined up, and so maybe the timing is better, for this group, the folks on this call, and maybe some others to work on something would be great, while we're working on the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not opposed to getting the cart out in front of the horse a little bit. So back to one of your questions there, Claire, about the activities and things like that. I know several of us met with folks at King Ranch back in the fall. And one of the things I talked to Brandon about it, I guess he's the ranch manager. I don't know, maybe I might have my roles mixed up. But anyways, I talked to him about possibility of doing some sort of a field day or something like that out there at King Ranch. And they were certainly supportive of doing things of that nature. We'd obviously have to coordinate with them on the specifics and timing and all that things. But we've got some opportunities to do some field days. So that'd certainly be something that we could coordinate with the local county extension agents and probably some of the regional AgriLife extension folks, and obviously the King Ranch and all of the resources that they have, and folks at A&M Kingsville on doing some appropriate field days and things of that nature. So those are certainly opportunities. And then there's others as well that are relative to ag and I guess wildlife even. So again, the folks at A&M Kingsville would be a great resource for that as well. So we can certainly talk those up. So I guess put some thought into what might be needed or might be useful as far as those types of on the ground activities. I think timing is right for doing some of those. I think people are itching to get out and go talk to people in person again. So I know I am, and they would probably jump at the opportunity to go do some of that type of stuff in the not too distant future. Well, what else? Any other thoughts, ideas, suggestions, questions, concerns, anything at this point? I think from my perspective, we have gleaned the information that we needed to give Ennis marching orders on what to do next. So Ennis, wave to everybody. Ennis is one of our graduate research assistants at the Water Resources Institute, and he's the man behind a lot of this stuff, and is doing a lot of the legwork for us on that. So we'll be working with him over the next couple of weeks to get the next, I guess, bits and pieces of information pulled together. And we haven't talked to him about it yet, but I may even give him a crash course in that select model, so he can add that to his resume later on. But anyways, I've got all the information I need, so I think Claire's just gonna show you all that survey right quick, and then we can call it a day.
Yeah, I'm just gonna quickly do one more quick plea that y'all please fill out the survey that I posted in the chat. I'm gonna post it one more time. It's not terribly long. It's broken up kind of livestock BMPs, wildlife management BMPs, and cropland BMPs. And really what we're trying to figure out is if you think that this practice is going to be popular to be implemented in the Baffin Bay watershed. And if you are a landowner, would you yourself be willing to implement this practice on your property? So just something to help us get an idea of what some of these things, and we tried to include the name and a brief description of what that includes. So we are ending a little early. So I hope if this is only going to take a few minutes that y'all could just quickly fill this out. If you have any other additional thoughts as you're going through this about, you know, the BMPs or anything from the meeting, feel free to kind of just write it down here. And we'll also be sending this out to some other groups as well to try to, in the watershed, to try to, you know, figure out what might be some good ideas to put into this plan. So that's my last little spiel. For next steps for the stakeholder group at large. So, you know, we will take a little bit of time to do those select modeling, play with those deer and feral hog numbers a little bit. So we hope, you know, by maybe the end of May, we get together for our next meeting, and we'll do that the same way we did this time. We'll send out a doodle poll. We really appreciate y'all filling that out. So we try to choose a time that works best for everyone since we are a smaller group. And we appreciate y'all's thoughts and comments. I think we've got some good ideas for how to move forward with the plan.
Yep, absolutely. And thank you all for your time this afternoon, and appreciate all the information y'all provided.
That'd be great. I see your note, Brian, so I'll definitely call on you to do a larger presentation to the group about WQMPs.
Okay, well, thanks, y'all. Lucas, I'll get you that contact information for Wade.
All right, sounds good, Jim. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
See y'all later.